All right. Good evening. My name is Francis Fukuyama. I am a senior fellow at Stanford University. I'm the director of the Center on Democracy, Development, and the Rule of Law. I'd like to welcome you to this Night Owl session that has a number of really excellent co-sponsors. One of them is the EPRC. Nino has been extremely helpful in setting this up. I'd also like to acknowledge the British Embassy and the American Embassy that have given support to this event. So we are going to begin with some short interventions by the President and the Prime Minister and the American Ambassador. The topic of the discussion tonight is In Search of Democracy. It is a particularly appropriate topic for Georgia because Georgia really stands out among former parts of the Soviet Union as one of the real bastions of democracy, one that is under threat, as are many democracies around the world as we speak. And so that's one of the reasons I am extremely happy to be back in Georgia today. So let me begin by introducing President Giorgi Margvelashvili. We met when I was here the last time, about a year and a half ago. So please, Mr. President.
Thank you, Professor Fukuyama, dear Prime Minister, ambassadors, ministers, respected guests. Let me welcome you at this great event that is happening once again in Tbilisi. The Leadership Forum is extremely important for furthering our path towards democracy, towards good governance, and deepening our ties and relationships with the cultural and political area of European and Euro-Atlantic community. It's 25th year of Georgia's independence, new independence, I would say, because our nation is quite 3,000 years old, but for our new statehood is it's the 25th year anniversary this year, and this year we clearly see that we have achieved independence from the system which was called Soviet Union, independence from Russian Empire's new form, which was Soviet Union, and we started our independence by being a new independent state, but there is quite a bit to achieve to become really free. And freedom means being identical to your values, identical to your passion. It means developing and building a state that your nation has chose to build to. In this respect, we have a long path to go, a long path which Professor Fukuyama mentioned as very complicated, especially for countries that are neighboring Russian Federation, but a path on which there is one solution which we can build only through democratic development. Through democratic development, because democracy means exactly what freedom means. It means listening to your people, listening to your community, making decisions together with your community, and making the decisions that are furthering your choice. Of course, this choice is challenged from time to time. It's challenged by your neighbors. It's challenged by the problems and conflicts that have become even more complicated this time in our neighborhood, because Georgia is a part of Georgia's bigger neighborhood, whether it's conflict in Ukraine or whether those are complications in Syria, is definitely influencing our path on prosperity and building a stable and secure society. But I would say that summing up our 25-year experience, I believe Georgia has reached great goals and great results. A country that is partially occupied by a very strong neighbor, which has problems with internally displaced people, a country which has problems with economic development, has still achieved the leading role in building democratic and free society, and we are all very much committed to furthering and strengthening this path. I welcome the leadership of Academy of Development here in Georgia, and I believe that your work and your engagement in furthering our intellectual as well as practical discussions on how to build a more free, efficient society and a more efficient governance, as well as developing business sector and initiatives within private sector, will have its serious influence on future of Georgia and its development. So today, we are hosting a person whose merits in the development of global democracy are priceless. Professor Francis Fukuyama, you impressively contributed to democratic progress in Georgia. I highly appreciate your role and your experience that were crucial for my country. It is my pleasure to award you with the Georgia's Order of Honor for your merits and achievements on Georgia's democratic path.
Mr. President, thank you. It's a really deep honor to be given this award, and I want to thank you very much. So I'd now like to introduce the Prime Minister, Giorgi Kvirikashvili.
Mr. President, dear ministers, dear ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, let me express great honor that I'm glad to be here to join you at this night owl session. I would like to congratulate Professor Fukuyama on this excellent award, and I would like to express my deep gratitude for arranging this very interesting discussion. It is exciting to join such a distinguished group for the opening of the Leadership Academy of Development. The brain power gathered here in this room is really impressive. And I'm sure that this program will have a major impact in developing our most important resource, our human capital. We are especially grateful to Stanford University Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law and the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies for founding the Leadership Academy of Development. I would also like to acknowledge the Economic Policy Research Center and Ilia State University for their tremendous support for this program. I would like to take a moment to thank again Francis Fukuyama, David Kramer, Catherine Stoner, and Alan Traeger for their support of Georgia. It is an honor to count such great thinkers and scholars as our nation's friends. Thank you for all that you have done and will do for Georgia. The timing of this program is excellent. I understand the main focus of your discussions is the role of public policy in private sector development. Last month, when I was confirmed as Prime Minister, I made clear that economic development, encouraging an entrepreneurial spirit, and alleviating the bureaucratic burden for businesses are among our top priorities. I should also mention that European and Euro-Atlantic integration remain our top foreign policy priority. I believe we can transform Georgia by promoting a spirit of entrepreneurship. We often see that existing businesses develop at full swing, while new businesses fail to attract financing for their ideas. To address this, we are going to launch new programs and financing vehicles to promote startups. We will dedicate significant resources and energy to support new enterprises and empower young people with innovative ideas. Most importantly, these efforts will help foster a strong middle class and provide jobs for younger generation. I believe a free society and stable investment environment are key factors in a nation's long-term growth. Georgia is a champion of liberty and democracy in the region. It is an honor to now lead the effort that the Georgian Dream Coalition began in 2012 to create an open and accountable government that listens to the people we serve. Over the past years, not only 3 years, Georgia has made steady gains in strengthening democratic institutions and has won international recognition for its progress in the rule of law, human rights, and governance. Our government established a genuine system of political checks and balances. We have also ensured the judiciary and law enforcement systems are depoliticized. These reform policies have enabled us to maintain economic growth and political stability amidst the backdrop of regional instability. Of course, we are still very far from being ideal. We have ups and downs, but it is very hard not to recognize the very healthy underlying trend that we witness. In closing, I would also like to know I want to know how much the Georgian government values the important discussions. I'm sorry. In closing, I would like you to know how much the Georgian government values the important discussions you will be having over the next few days. I am confident that these discussions will spur ideas that help advance our economic and democratic development. I hope those of you visiting here for the first time will take the time to see Georgia. In a very small country, we have packed in beautiful beaches, fantastic mountains, historic sites, and much more. Georgians are famous for their hospitality, and our food and wine are delicious. So please enjoy all Georgia has to offer, and then bring back your friends. Once again, I would like to thank the organizers and all the participants. I wish you all the best for a productive week. Thank you.
Yes, we are definitely going. We've already enjoyed the food, and on Saturday we're all going to go visit the wine region. So I assure you that we're going to take advantage of our being here in Georgia. So I would like to invite the Honorable Ian Kelly, Ambassador of the United States.
I want to thank Dr. Fukuyama and the organizers for inviting me to speak tonight. It really is quite an honor for me to address such a distinguished group. And it's also a privilege, I think, for the United States to support this very important initiative and this important workshop. I thought I'd take the few minutes allotted to me to talk a little bit about why the United States, why the stakes are so high for the United States and for all of us to support Georgian democracy. When I think about one foreign policy priority for our embassy, I think it can be summed up as supporting Georgia's sovereign choice to integrate with the Euro-Atlantic community. And I think that program of support rests on three pillars. One, to safeguard Georgian sovereignty. Two, to ensure Georgian prosperity. And then third, to enhance stability. I think one of the keys, of course, to ensuring Georgian sovereignty is Georgia's aspirations to join NATO, and we firmly support Georgia's aspirations to join NATO. The recent NATO foreign ministerial meeting, I think, shows that the open door policy is alive and well, and I think in a broader sense, Georgia already has the practical tools it needs to attain Georgia membership when that time comes, membership in NATO. These tools, along with the U.S.'s support for Georgia's participation in the NATO response force and an Operation Resolute mission in Afghanistan, these are all designed to enhance the security of Georgia by increasing its defense and deterrence capabilities and its resilience, while building sound democratic institutions in order to help them advance along the road to NATO membership. Of course, a strong democracy depends on a strong economy that can provide prosperity for the country's people. And I firmly believe that if Georgia's quest to integrate with the West is to succeed, it is critical that we help Georgia improve its climate for trade and investment and tourism. Finally, the best guarantor, I think, of stability is an open, inclusive society where political pluralism thrives and the rule of law is respected. And I think in order to attain that, it's very important to have a vigorous competition of ideas. I think George is far along on that road, of course, of having that kind of environment. And of course, for this, you need to have a level playing field, an open space for all voices, especially in an election year like this one. I think to attain a really strong democracy, there are a couple of sub-pillars, and these two sub-pillars, I think, is a strong and independent judiciary. I think there have been some very important reforms, as the President and Prime Minister have mentioned, and we stand with Georgia as it implements some of these reforms. Second is a viable opposition. And Georgia must continue to establish and maintain an environment for political and minority groups where they can freely express their views. And this is a very necessary and healthy step in political growth. We also, I think, are very supportive of a free and open media environment. I think that this is very important in order to assure that political parties can respond to the opinion of the people and the needs of the people. And of course, it will also bring Georgia closer to its goal of integration with the Euro-Atlantic community. So these three elements, sovereignty, prosperity, and stability, are specific priorities for our embassy. We use all of the different resources of our embassy, the different agencies that we have to help Georgia move closer to Europe and move closer to the United States through institutions like the European Union and NATO. And just finally, we don't invest in Georgia just because we're nice people. We invest in Georgia because your success is absolutely critical to the peace and stability of this entire region. So we really want you to succeed. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador. I understand that President Margvelashvili has another commitment, and so thank you very much for joining us this evening. All right, so the rest of the evening session is actually a panel discussion between myself and David Kramer, who is currently with the McCain Institute, but for many years was the head of the great organization Freedom House, and before that, an important official in the State Department. So without further ado, we will begin.
Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for being here this evening. This is a tremendously impressive turnout, so we really want to welcome all of you, and we will actually make this interactive after a few minutes of exchange between the two of us. But it's a great gathering of people here, and it's great to be back in Georgia. This is actually my third visit in the past year, and it's a wonderful country, as the President and the Prime Minister said. The hospitality is overwhelming in certain respects, so I'm great to be here. And it's a great privilege of mine to have this opportunity to have an exchange with Professor Fukuyama, a giant in the field for sure. And my thanks to you and for Stanford and your center and to the EPRC for bringing us together here today. So, Frank, I'm going to ask you a pretty simple question, and we're going to step back from Georgia and look at the whole globe. And it's a question that's probably on a lot of minds in this room, which is, what has happened? It seems like the world is a bit of a mess, and that democracy is in retreat, the authoritarian regimes are on the assault, non-state actors are causing havoc. What's going on here?
Well, David, I wish I knew.
Okay, next question.
But I think that we need to actually define what's going on in different parts of the world, because I think we have different problems in different regions. So in Eurasia, I think the phenomenon that you've seen is basically the rise of powerful centralized states and the return of geopolitics. And that's basically China and Russia. I would say China actually to a much greater extent than Russia, because the Chinese economic model is much more sophisticated and broad than the Russian one. And that's a kind of classic return to the 19th century, where you have powerful centralized states, they have ambitions, they've got territorial claims, and in a certain sense, that's a very familiar territory to be on. It's not one that is good for democracy, because neither of those countries is a democracy, and they've made severe challenges to the integrity of their neighbors. But I think the more, in a way, or equally troubling phenomenon is, in a way, the opposite, which is taking place in the Arab Middle East, in Africa, sub-Saharan Africa, in that whole band that goes all the way up to the borders of India, where the problem is exactly the opposite, which is essentially a breakdown of state authority or extreme weakness in terms of state capacity. You've had this unprecedented situation where 4 Arab countries, Syria, Iraq, Libya, and Yemen, have basically collapsed as governments. And we can discuss this further or in the Q&A session. It is my personal opinion that ISIS or the Islamic State, Al-Qaeda, all of these radical Islamist groups are actually not inherently that strong as political movements. I mean, who wants to live in a society that regularly beheads, anyone that challenges them in the slightest way, or really cannot govern, anything like a modern state. But the problem is state weakness in that entire region. I think these are threats that could be contained if you had coherent states, but there has been this gigantic crisis of state legitimacy. We thought for a long time that these Arab authoritarian regimes, like the ones that existed in Tunisia and Egypt and so forth, were actually bastions of stability because they had been around for several decades. But it was clear that there's a very, very deep crisis in legitimacy. And right now, I actually foresee a continuing period of instability, because I honestly don't know what's going to put back state authority in any of those regions. And then laid on top of that, you've got this spreading Sunni Shiite civil war that's being fed by this rivalry between Saudi Arabia and Iran. So this is a long-winded answer to your question. It depends. It depends on what part of the world we're in.
Would you also say that there seems to be a crisis of confidence among democracies, that democracies have not done a very effective job in uniting, joining forces to push back both against the authoritarian challenge, but also against the non-state challenge that we see?
Well, so that's a question I think you have to answer on a couple of different levels. So I think that actually the soft power being projected by the models represented by Europe and the United States on the one hand, and these authoritarian countries on the other, is actually the underlying story. And frankly, the United States suffered a huge financial crisis in 2008. The Euro zone fell into an equally serious crisis a couple of years later. And so the success, the apparent success of those economic models has been challenged. I think the United States also made a number of foreign policy mistakes as well, with the invasion of Iraq, and which cast democracy promotion in a bad light. And meanwhile, China, has been moving forward very, very rapidly. However, I would say that there is something big is going to happen, I think, in world politics because of the collapse of oil and of commodities more generally, because I do think that there's been a very strong relationship between resource-rich countries that are authoritarian and their apparent success in the world. And the obvious case of this is Russia. At 20, what is it? Brent hit something like $27 today. At those prices, Russia is really in technically what we scientists call deep, doo-doo.
Deep doo-doo. Let
Yes.
the record show. That's D-O-O-D-O-O.
Now, but I think the question that you are actually getting at is more one of diplomacy and political, whether especially the United States, but also a lot of the European allies of the United States have the right willpower and desire to push back against authoritarian regimes. And I think that the answer is no. I think that the United States, and by the way, this is not the first time this has happened. The United States always overlearns the last lesson, and the last lesson was overextension in Afghanistan and Iraq. And so now, we've had an administration that does not want to get sucked in. I actually prefer that position than to starting unnecessary wars, but that's just my opinion. However, I think that it's been very hard for the United States to get that balance right, and I do think that there are on many levels a degree of pushback that we should have been making and have not, and we could yet do that in the future.
So I do want to come to the United States in a minute, but before I do that, when you look around the globe, what 2 or 3 hopeful places do you see for standing out?
Look, it's not funny. There's a lot of hopeful stuff that's been going on. You've had a number of good elections. I mean, the NLD was elected in Burma. Yep. In Sri Lanka, you had a new government that came to power last year, and then there's another election this year that confirmed that they didn't want Mr. Rajapaksa and his authoritarian proclivities. In Latin America, you had this resounding defeat of the Chavistas in Venezuela, and in Argentina, you had this really pretty horrible populist government that was just replaced by, I think, a much more truly democratic one. And so I think that the popular, democracy doesn't come out of nowhere. There's really a social basis for it. I think that as the world has gotten richer, better educated, more urbanized, there is a bigger middle class. There are people that want political participation. They want to be part of of a larger world, and that's been driving the demand for democracy in many countries around the world. Now, I guess this will maybe ease us into this discussion of the United States and of Europe and other places as well. But there are also people that have been left out of that positive story, and I think, in a sense, that's kind of the big challenge that the developed democracies are going to face in the future.
You did mention Europe, so I just want to touch base there before we go to our country. There does seem to be one crisis after another consuming Europeans, drawing them more inward focused, and whether it's Brexit, refugees, you name it, one thing after another, latest developments in Poland causing serious concern. Europe's been a key player in advancing freedom and democracy, human rights, not just on the continent, but beyond. How big a challenge is this?
Well, I think it's a huge challenge. I think really the biggest problem in Europe right now is going to be an internal one, that Europe, unlike the United States, has had a less success. I mean, it varies from one European country to another, but they've had much less success assimilating, culturally different people. And I think the migrant crisis is simply just the last, push in a very dangerous direction that's set off a lot of populism and a general loss, I think, of confidence in a lot of European institutions. And so, that is, I think, a really serious issue for them. Plus which, the underlying problem that led to the euro crisis has not been solved. It's just not been solved. It's been swept under the rug for the time being, but it's going to come back in another form at a later point.
All right, I've delayed as much as possible talking about U.S. elections, but I'm afraid there's interest in the audience to talk about this. I was in Lithuania before coming here to Georgia, and several Lithuanians essentially said to me, "What the hell's going on in the United States?" So what the hell is going on in the United States?
Well, this is an advertisement for my last book, because my last book actually, the whole last section was about what I called political decay. And I think that the United States is suffering from a certain amount of political decay. So again, I got to go back to a kind of underlying story that's behind it. The American system is based on checks and balances. The American founding fathers were very concerned about the abuse, the potential abuse of concentrated political power. And so they designed an extremely complex constitutional system that spread power out among a lot of institutions. So we've got a very powerful upper house of Congress, a separately elected presidency, a judiciary that can overturn legislation, delegation to state and local levels, and we've been adding checks as time has gone on. And so, for example, it used to be that the Senate would pass legislation by a majority vote, and now every vote has to be a supermajority of 60, which means 40 senators can veto any legislation that they want. So that's a structural feature of the American system, which has existed for decades. But what's happened is two things. The first is the polarization of the American political class. There's a big argument among political scientists as to what is driving this. Partly it is social, that Americans themselves are sorting themselves out by where they live. And so you'll go to entire neighborhoods where everybody votes Republican or everybody votes Democratic. And then you have the rise of very powerful and well-organized interest groups. And this is really the core of what I call political decay, because in a democracy, a representative government, of course, has to reflect the interests of the population. But the problem in the American system is that it gives over-representation to the best organized and the best funded, and our Supreme Court in its wisdom has declared that basically spending money in politics is a form of free speech and therefore protected by the First Amendment, which I fail to comprehend the logic of this. And so if you bring these social trends together, you get what we've had in Washington over the past few years. Congress, the US Congress, has not passed a budget under its normal rules since 2008. It's just not done this. And every year there's a crisis because a certain part of Congress actually would rather shut the American government down rather than make a concession on some line item in the budget. This is not the way a mature government operates. Now, the thing that, and David and I have been talking about this nonstop, for the last couple of days. On top of that, you now have America joining in this populist parade that you see in Europe. I actually think that it has a common sociological basis that, so I said that this rising middle class that's cosmopolitan, tech savvy, connected to the rest of the world is driving democracy, but not everybody has enjoyed that, and there are a substantial number of people who are in the middle class, but they feel vulnerable. In the United States, real incomes of people with a high school education or less is now something like 12% lower than it was in 2007 prior to the crisis, and essentially working class incomes in the US have stagnated. since the 1970s. And I think that, if you look at who is voting for Donald Trump, it is that demographic. I mean, it turns out a lot of people, including a lot of college-educated people, also support him. But the core constituency is the same that supports Viktor Orban in Hungary, that is supporting Kaczynski in Poland, and that is supporting Vladimir Putin in Russia. These are people that are not really benefiting from globalization, not benefiting from all of the economic growth that's happened over the past couple of generations. And now in America, we've got this very live, phenomenon of Trumpism or Cruzism or whatever form it's going to take.
All right, well, let me open it up to the audience. Let me just warn you, however, that if you ask for any predictions about who's going to win, I would say, with all due respect to Frank, but I'll certainly put myself in this category, they aren't worth anything. When I was here in September, people were saying, there's no way Trump could be the nominee, right? Well, sitting here now, I'm not sure I would say that. So if you want to ask predictions, go ahead, but ask them of Frank, not of me. Who would like to go first? Over there, yes, and then here. And if you would, please identify yourselves, and a microphone is heading your way.
I represent International Black Sea University. First of all, thank you very much, and for me, it's great honor to be and interesting report. And with your permission, I have a question related to the role of the National Democratic Society to prevent all those threats and challenges which exist in the world, taking into consideration the gap between the global north and south, where in the global north, the part of the number of population is about 1 billion, but at the same time, on their share is coming more than 70% of GDP. At the same time, taking into consideration the fact that there are about 1.5 billion people whose income in the world prevail $1 per day, and majority of the countries still they are non-democratic according to the Freedom House. And to the 2013, there were 53 parties, and 47 authoritarian countries, including you mentioned here about the People's Republic of China and Russia. So we can't discuss too much about each. What do you think? It's an international society, democratic society, where you also take into consideration the demographic problems, where the number of population in the world is increasing for about 80 million people, and 90% is coming from the share of the country from the global south. So the number of the percentage of the people in the global north is gradually decreasing. So how the international democratic society should prevent these threats and challenges
Well, so I think the underlying rates of population growth have very little to do with it. One of the fastest growing countries in the world is India, which is going to surpass, if it has not already, China in size. And it's actually, given what it is, it's a remarkably successful democracy. So there is an overall correlation between wealth and democracy, but it's not a universal one, and I think that's not what we should be focusing on. Now, there is this phenomenon of what my colleague Larry Diamond calls a democratic recession. So if you go to the Freedom House, Freedom in the World rankings, this is now the 9th consecutive year in which the aggregate level of democracy as measured by Freedom House in its two metrics has declined.
I think we'll be coming up on a 10th year.
Yeah.
When it comes out in 2 weeks.
Yeah, and so that decline is going to continue. So then the question is, how should we regard this? Is this like a stock market correction where the overall, and by the way, I don't think you're right. I mean, it obviously depends on how you measure democracy, but according to Larry Diamond, in the year 1970, by these same metrics, there are approximately 35 electoral democracies in the world, and even in 2015, with all the setbacks, they're still on the neighborhood of 110, right? So we've gone from about a third of the world living under some kind of democratic contestation to maybe 60, 65% of the world living in that kind of a country. So it's impressive. I mean, there's been a lot of growth of democracy. But what does the future hold? And I think you really need to pay attention to the price of oil, because I really think that it is the soft power projected by these different models that really drives countries, perceptions of what kind of model they want to adopt for themselves. And quite frankly, what's driving Viktor Orban, in everything that he's done in the past few years? It's not external pressure. It's not that the EU and the United States have somehow failed Hungary. He just thinks that there's a model out there that's, he can use as an opportunistic politician, and he can sell it, and that model looked good as long as Russia looked good. But when Russia looks like a basket case economically, which it's on the road to doing, I'm not sure that he's going to be able to sell that model so well. And this is why I actually have thought for some time that the single most important thing that both Europe and the United States can do if they want to preserve democracy around the world is get their own damn house in order. They really need to get their own house. I mean, the United States has got to get past this paralyzing polarization and political paralysis. And Europe has got to fix institutions both at a European level and on a domestic level in many individual countries. And that involves, in the first instance, getting their economies going again.
Before I come to you, just a quick, you mentioned several times, Frank, the price of oil. Can you explain what Saudi Arabia is up to? I mean, here's a country that's one of the worst abusers of human rights. It's having an impact on its own economy. What really is driving the Saudis and continuing to pump out oil as much as it is?
Well, I don't talk to them very much.
They're having drinks with us after. So.
Yeah, okay. No, I mean, my presumption, so Saudi Arabia was the big swing producer in OPEC, and it was the only country that had enough margin because of its low population and high output where they could actually restrict output in a way that could drive up the price. And they didn't want to do this in this downturn for a couple of reasons, that they wanted to get at Iran, they wanted to get at Russia, and then they wanted to drive all these new American shale producers out of business. So, the biggest story in the energy markets in the past decade is not Saudi Arabia or Iran or anything. It is the United States. The United States has doubled its oil output. The United States does not import any oil anymore. And in fact, the Congress just lifted the export ban, and so the United States is actually set to become a net oil exporter. And so the Saudis didn't like this, and they set off this, they accelerated what would have been a trend anyhow to, for lower prices. But now they're riding this tiger that they can't get off of, and it's gotten to the point where they no longer have any margin themselves. They've had to cut their budget. They've actually gone on international capital markets. So that's on the economic side. On the political side, I think they're just nuts. I mean, I think this war that they started in Yemen was unnecessary. It reminds me of the way the United States during the Cold War would interpret every local nationalist uprising as part of a big communist conspiracy. And I think that's the way that this young Saudi prince, the deputy crown prince, interpreted the Houthi, advances in Yemen. And so now they've leaped into this. They've behaved very destructively in Yemen, and it's going to have big blowback consequences. If you want reasons to be pessimistic about the future of the Middle East, I think that you could see this civil war spreading to the Gulf. So the Arab Spring pretty much left the Persian Gulf unscathed, these traditional monarchies, the UAE, Oman, Saudi Arabia. I'm not sure that you can take that for granted as we go forward because of, I think, some policy mistakes that the Saudis have made.
All right, why don't we take a couple here, right there, second row, and I see another hand.
Thank you. My name is Margvelashvili at the Center for Strategic Communication and Democracy. I have two questions. One is a follow-up on sort of more global situation, and I wanted to know your opinion regarding China and its ability to project soft power. Russia's sort of, power going down, but what about the Chinese, and what is the explanation of their relative success or failure in terms of projecting soft power? And the second question concerns our country. Of course, you haven't mentioned Georgia amongst the places which look hopeful. And we're just starting our election year with the political system, which is a bit bizarre, as you know. What's your assessment of the Georgian paradigm of democratic transition where we stand now, and how do you assess our chances for success? Thank you.
Others over here, right here. There comes a mic right there.
George Welton, the American Chamber of Commerce. Just a continuation on bringing things a bit local. So you said that Russia and China have basically returned to a sort of 19th century way of doing business. So what does Georgia do about that?
Oh, that's a good one. I have an answer to that one.
That was not a planted question.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
All right, so with regard to China, I have this sneaking suspicion that the slowdown in China is actually much more dramatic. They're going to announce the latest fourth quarter GDP, and they're predicting that it's going to be around 6.9% for the trailing year. I think the real number is probably significantly lower than that. And the Chinese have been anticipating this. You cannot keep up double-digit growth, when you're the second largest economy in the world, and the consequences of that are going to be very difficult for them because they've got a growing middle class. They've been able to give all of those people jobs and stability and upward mobility over the last generation, but when they cease being able to do that and you have large unemployment in China, I think that it's going to affect the legitimacy of that regime. Now, I don't think that China projects much soft power at all, except through its economic success. But very few people love Chinese movies or want to dress like Chinese, stars, or want to travel. I mean, people travel to China, but it's not the first destination. People go to. There are many more Chinese that want to, and in fact, a lot of Chinese are getting their money out of China right now because they don't think it's all that safe. But the problem, for all of China's problems, in the short run, I don't think it makes any difference because it's not Chinese soft power you need to worry about, it's Chinese hard power. In this part of the world, I don't think people follow these territorial disputes in Asia, but they are very dangerous. Chinese are building these artificial islands in area that's claimed by the Philippines, Malaysia, Vietnam, and nobody can do very much about it. And here the United States, I think, really has an important role in pushing back, as we did when we sent this destroyer, the Lassen, within the 12-mile zone of one of these islands that the Chinese were building. But they're pretty clear about what they're doing. They're saying we are always a great power. The rest of the world does not recognize this, but we're going to assert our rights as a great power. That doesn't mean we're going to invade our neighbors, but we're going to assert that. With regard to Georgian politics, things always look more problematic from the inside than they do from the outside, and I think that you need to say compared to what. And in that respect, I think that Georgia, has actually done remarkably well. So my real interest in Georgia had its origins, I've been very interested in governance. And I think that one of the big failures of a lot of new democracies has been what's happened after the first election that brings a truly democratic regime to power, like the Orange and Rose revolutions back in 2004. And in this respect, Georgia did a lot better than Ukraine because it really tried to grapple with service delivery, with the quality of government, with corruption. And the Ukrainians failed to do that. And the Ukrainians now have a second chance. And this is so important for their survival that they actually get a hold of this problem. And in this respect, I think that it's very important that whatever party is governing or whatever coalition is governing Georgia, that they need to keep a focus on that in controlling corruption, in improving the capacity of the Georgian state to be a kind of neutral deliverer of services impersonally to the Georgian people. So I would say relative to virtually every other country in the former Soviet communist space, Georgia is doing pretty well. So there's obviously things that could be done a lot better in terms of the way the opposition is treated, or level playing fields and so forth. But I think you need to keep that in mind. Now, the question about Russia and China, I think this is a huge opportunity for Georgia. So China has this One Belt, One Road. It's a mind-bogglingly ambitious plan to transform the whole of Inner Asia and basically extend these lines of communication from Southeast Asia through Western China, then on through Central Asia, all the way to Europe on the one hand, and then down into the Middle East and India on the other. And who does this challenge? Whose status and prestige does this challenge the most? It isn't the United States, They're building all this stuff. They're going to build this stuff right through what the Russians consider a Russian sphere of influence. And it gets right down to these nitty-gritty kinds of things like what gauge railroad track are people going to use when they're traveling, when all these containers are moving across this big highway, because the Russians have got one and it's different from the one that the Chinese want to use. And so there's just a huge number of conflicts built into that relationship. And for a small country like Georgia that is being courted or is having a relationship with both of these countries, that's a big opportunity. That's a big opportunity because I think you can play, one off against the other. Because China is already giving Georgia some important opportunities for alternative sources of trade and commerce and gas and, a lot of other things.
I would just very quickly add on your Georgia question. There's a fair bit of time between now and the actual elections, but it's a time to ensure, as Frank said, a level playing field to ensure that all parties have an opportunity to participate without any obstacles. Transparency on energy issues to ensure that there is full openness on any discussions there, and hands off the media, to let the media function as they should, and report factually and separate actual journalism from opinion making. Those, I think, are important things that the international community will be looking for in the, 10 months or so ahead. I think how hard is this deadline, Nino? All right, if there are a couple, okay, if there are one or two more questions, we'll take them, but then we'll close it up. Going once, there's a hand in the back. This will be the last question. So make it a good one.
Gentlemen, thanks a lot for very interesting discussion. This is Giorgi Rukadze, Georgia Development Foundation. As long as this is the last question, it's going to be the long question. So a double-barreled question. So you mentioned that oil price is going down. The US, the OPEC states, all others are driving price down. And the one who suffers most is Russia. And what will be your estimate how far the trend can possibly go? And obviously, if this continues, the Russia will become more insecure and more aggressive, because the more insecure it gets, the aggressive it might turn. So does the US has a plan how to handle weak Russia? That's one question. And the second question is about Georgia. What will you say of a country where 70% of population does not support any major political party? 70% of population is disillusioned. what is the way to go forward, do you think? And the last bit. The sanctions were lifted out of Iran. What will be your advice to Georgian government? How can they make best use of this opportunity? Thank you.
Well, so if you come back to the Night Owl session tomorrow,
That's a great advertisement.
you will be able to hear my colleague, Catherine Stoner, who's just spent the last week in Moscow, and she can answer your question about what's going to happen to Russia. On the question of does the U.S. have a plan for dealing with a weak Russia, I can probably say pretty confidently, no. We don't have plans. I don't think we've been operating with much of a plan for anything in the last few years. On the question of Georgia and general apathy, I think that this is a broader question than just for Georgia, because there is a broad feeling, especially among young people all across Europe, of a disillusionment with traditional parties. And that's part of what's been driving a lot of this new populism, that you have these complete outsider parties like the National Front in France that is, I think, feeding off of this anti-political sentiment, and that's what's driving, Trump and Cruz and a lot of these, what we thought were very marginal Republican candidates. And so there's something broader going on with disillusionment in general with politics. And then, I'm sorry, the last part of the question was? Iran. Iran, I think, it's in the grip of a big struggle between this hardline political base with Ayatollah Khamenei at the top, and I think probably a majority of Iranian society that actually wants a much more liberal Iran. These were the people that came out during the Green Revolution a few years ago. And I think that ultimately what happens internationally with Iran is completely dependent on how that internal struggle develops. The old man has got to die sometime. And that will really be the critical moment when Iran could actually transform itself into a very different kind of society. Up until then, everybody's got to be super careful. And it's difficult because, I actually supported the agreement, the nuclear agreement with Iran, precisely because it does seem to me that rejecting it out of hand would actually strengthen the wrong people inside the country. But it's not a done deal yet, and we're just going to have to wait and see how this internal struggle plays out. And a lot of countries are going to try to take advantage of this economically in the meantime, which as a whole I would say is probably not a good thing, because it's going to strengthen Iran, and we don't want to see that country any stronger than it needs to be.
Just before closing on your question about the undecided segment of the electorate, it's an opportunity for political parties to get their message and campaign across. So I hope Georgians can use this time to insist on real answers to substantive questions about where the country is going. I say that as an American, in which personalized attacks from one candidate against another have become common in our campaigns. But it really is an opportunity, I think. And hopefully it will sharpen the debate here. It will heighten the importance for the governing party to deliver and for the opposition parties to offer an alternative vision. So with that, let me ask you to join me in thanking Professor Fukuyama for a terrific discussion. On behalf of the hosts, Mr. Prime Minister, ministers, ladies and gentlemen, Your Excellencies, thank you for coming.